Caleb Mercer stopped reading the ranch ledger the moment he saw the widow's name written beside his debts. The coffee pot rattled softly on the stove as Ruth stood frozen beside the kitchen table, snow melting from the hem of her coat onto Caleb Mercer's floorboards. His thumb pressed hard against a folded receipt-stained brown with old coffee, but he never looked away from her face. Outside, a horse kicked once against the stable gate, and then Caleb asked her something she never expected to hear in that house. The train from St. Louis pulled into Miles City beneath a low gray sky that looked heavy enough to snow before nightfall. Smoke drifted across the freight yard, mixing with the smell of wet timber and horse sweat, while men unloaded crates beside the depot platform. Ruth Ellison stepped down carrying a dark trunk with one worn corner split at the seam, her brown wool coat buttoned high against the wind. In her pocket rested a folded packet of medical notices tied carefully with blue thread. She stood still for a moment, not because she was lost, because there was nowhere left to go back to. 3 days earlier, she had sold the last of her husband's furniture to a railway porter outside St. Louis Union Station. The dishes went first, then the lamp, then the narrow bed frame her husband had once promised to replace after his routes improved. By the end, all she kept were her clothes, a pair of repaired gloves, and the small church Bible tucked beneath the clothing in her trunk. The woman running the rooming house above Mercer Feed and Supply looked Ruth over without rudeness, but not warmly either. She pushed the guest ledger across the counter and explained that winter always filled the rooms with cattle buyers and stranded travelers once the roads froze north of town. "You can stay 3 nights on credit," she said. "After that, I'll need payment." Ruth nodded once, no arguing, no pleading. Outside, sleet had begun tapping softly against the boardwalk roofs. A ranch hand loading grain sacks mentioned that Caleb Mercer out at Broken Wheel Ranch needed somebody to sort inventory records after his regular clerk injured his hand during branding season. He laughed afterward and said most folks quit working for Mercer before the second snowfall. Ruth asked where the ranch sat. "Powder Creek Road," the man answered. 8 muddy miles if your horse stays upright." By the time Ruth reached Broken Wheel Ranch, daylight had already started fading behind the cottonwoods. Mud clung thick to the mare's legs. The ranch gate leaned slightly where one hinge had warped from old weather, and smoke drifted from the main house chimney in thin, uneven streams. Caleb Mercer answered the door himself. Tall, broad through the shoulders, dark coat still dusted with stable hay. He carried the look of a man who slept little and trusted slowly. "You here for work?" he asked. Ruth removed one glove finger by finger before answering. "If the position's still open." Caleb stepped aside without ceremony. The kitchen smelled faintly of coffee gone bitter on the stove. Ledgers and loose invoices covered nearly half the table beside an oil lamp burning low. As he crossed the room, Ruth noticed a feed store receipt folded twice inside his coat pocket, stained brown from old coffee near the edge. Billings Cattle Auction printed faintly across the top. "You worked ranch books before?" Caleb asked. "My husband handled freight schedules for the railroad," Ruth said carefully. "I kept records for him when his eyesight worsened." Caleb grunted softly, neither impressed nor doubtful. "Most people come out here thinking bookkeeping means sitting near a warm stove. Winter changes their minds." Ruth sat at the table and opened the nearest ledger. Wind rattled lightly against the kitchen window, while pages turned beneath her fingers. Numbers filled the margins in different handwriting. Feed totals repeated themselves across separate dates. After several quiet minutes, she looked up. "You paid twice for October barley deliveries." Caleb stopped near the stove. Ruth slid the ledger gently across the table. "Here, and here again 3 pages later." Their fingers brushed briefly over the paper as he took it back. Caleb pulled his hand away first. The silence afterward was not uncomfortable exactly, just careful. He studied the pages for a long moment before rubbing a tired hand across his jaw. Outside, somewhere near the stable, a horse kicked once against frozen wood. "You ride all the way from town today?" he asked. "Yes." "In this weather?" Ruth glanced toward the darkening window. Didn't seem wise to wait until it worsened. Something shifted across Caleb's face then. Not softness, recognition maybe. Like he'd understood the kind of person who kept moving because stopping cost too much. Without another word, he reached for the lantern hanging beside the door. "Come on," he said. They crossed the muddy yard together, beneath a rising wind. Caleb unlocked a narrow office beside the stable, the room smelling faintly of dust, leather, and old paper. A small iron stove stood cold in the corner beside a desk scarred with knife marks. "You can use this space," he said. "Starts warming up decent once the fire catches." Ruth set her trunk carefully beside the wall. Caleb rested one hand against the doorway before looking back at her. "You can start at dawn," he said, "if you truly mean to stay through winter." Ruth met his eyes steadily for the first time since arriving. "I do," she said quietly. And for reasons he could not yet explain, Caleb believed her. The first snow arrived 3 days later, thin and dry, drifting sideways across the pastures like sifted flour. By dawn, the fence posts wore white caps, and the wind carried the sharp smell of frozen earth through every crack in the stable walls. Ruth sat alone in the office beside the stable, with her sleeves rolled neatly above her wrists, sorting invoices beneath the weak glow of a kerosene lamp. The ranch books were worse than she first thought. Feed deliveries had been copied twice in different handwriting. Horse medicine orders appeared without matching receipts. One ledger listed hay, purchased from Hollow Creek Feed Company 2 weeks before the roads had even reopened from rain. Ruth pressed her lips together. Someone had been careless or dishonest. Outside, ranch hands moved through the morning dark leading horses toward the north pasture. Caleb's voice carried low across the yard now and then, steady enough to calm nervous animals without ever rising loud. Ruth found herself listening for it without meaning to. By the second week, small things around Broken Wheel Ranch had begun changing shape. Coffee waited warm near the tack room before riders returned from the cold. Missing records were tied neatly together with fresh twine. Medicine bottles no longer vanished beneath loose papers and saddle catalogs. Ruth even repaired the curtain hanging crooked over the office window. One evening, after the wind tore 2 stitches loose, nobody mentioned these things directly. Still, everybody noticed. Caleb spent most days in the training pen working a difficult gray gelding recently brought in from Rosebud Creek. The horse fought every rein pull with stiff anger, throwing foam along the bit while Caleb stayed patient in the saddle, speaking little. Some afternoons Ruth watched from the office doorway while pretending to organize feed tallies. He never forced the horse harder than necessary. She respected that. One cold evening, Caleb stepped inside the office, carrying snow across the floorboards on his boots. Ruth sat bent over the payroll ledger, wearing the same brown wool coat she wore. Every morning, the right cuff mended carefully with dark green thread that almost matched if nobody looked too close. "You still working on November grain counts?" he asked. Ruth nodded without looking up. "Your supplier invoices don't agree with the freight receipts. That bad? Worse than bad usually is." Caleb gave the faintest huff of amusement before hanging his gloves near the stove. For a while, only the scratch of Ruth's pencil filled the room. Then Caleb noticed her pause. She flexed her right hand, once beneath the table, pressing her thumb against her wrist before continuing to write. Too many hours gripping a pen. Without speaking, Caleb crossed to the desk and set his own fountain pen beside her ledger. Black handle, silver nib worn smooth near the grip. "This one catches easier," he said. "Less strain on the fingers." Ruth looked up then, surprised enough that her expression softened before she could hide it. "You're certain?" she asked. "I can still sign my own name with the other one." For a second, neither moved. Then Ruth accepted the pen carefully, almost like returning kindness required caution. Caleb turned away first and added another log to the stove, though the room was already warm enough. The snow deepened through the following week. Wagon wheels carved frozen ruts along Powder Creek Road, and riders came back from town with ice gathered white along their collars. At supper, the ranch hands talked quietly about cattle prices and rumors of another harsh winter pushing down from Canada. Ruth mostly listened, but Caleb noticed she had stopped eating in a hurry. One night after the others drifted out toward the bunkhouse, Ruth remained alone at the kitchen table, comparing freight totals beside a chipped green coffee mug. Caleb stood washing his hands at the sink when she suddenly frowned at the page. "What is it?" he asked. Ruth slid the invoice toward him. "Hollow Creek Feed Company billed you twice for hay shipments that never reached the ranch," she said quietly. "And somebody signed the deliveries anyway." Caleb studied the paper, his jaw tightening slowly. Outside, the wind rattled hard against the stable doors. Inside the kitchen, something colder settled between them than the weather itself. Caleb stood motionless beside the stove, staring down at the Hollow Creek invoices spread beneath the lamp. Snowmelt dripped slowly from the hem of his coat onto the wooden floorboards, while Ruth waited across the table with both hands folded near the chipped green mug. Neither raised their voice. Somehow that made the silence heavier. "You sure about this?" Caleb finally asked. Ruth nodded once. "The freight records don't match the delivery signatures. Somebody billed the ranch for shipments that never arrived." Caleb lowered himself into the chair beside the ledger, rubbing a rough hand over his mouth. For several long seconds he said nothing at all. Ruth noticed how tired he suddenly looked under the lamplight, older than he had the week before. "Could ruined us by spring," he muttered. The next morning he rode into Miles City before daylight with the false invoices folded inside his saddlebag. Ruth watched from the office window as his horse disappeared through blowing snow along Powder Creek Road. She told herself the tight feeling in her chest came only from worry over the ranch accounts. It did not entirely. 3 days later, the weather turned worse. Gray skies hung low over eastern Montana, and the streets near the freight depot became thick with frozen mud and wagon ruts. Ruth walked to the courthouse carrying a stack of corrected feed receipts. Caleb needed notarized before the bank meeting next week. She almost did not recognize the man waiting beneath the awning. Tall, narrow shoulders, black leather document case tucked beneath one arm. The faded initials of the Midwestern Pacific Rail Company still showed across the flap, though the company itself had collapsed after the summer strike back in St. Louis. "Mrs. Ellison." Ruth stopped cold. Mr. Pritchard removed his gloves slowly, like a man in no hurry because unpleasant business always waited obediently for him. Snow clung wet along the brim of his hat. "You traveled a long way to avoid these papers," he said quietly. Ruth tightened her grip on the receipts. "I traveled to find work. The debt remains regardless." He handed her another folded notice. Medical balances, freight loans, outstanding funeral transport fees she had never even known existed until after her husband died, coughing blood into handkerchiefs he thought she never saw. Ruth stared at the paper without unfolding it. Across the street, Caleb emerged from Dunbar Mercantile carrying fence staples and lamp oil. He slowed when he saw them standing beneath the courthouse awning. Wind swept loose snow between the buildings while Mr. Pritchard continued, speaking in his careful voice. "If payment arrangements are not made soon, collection proceedings may extend westward," he said, "including employer notification." Ruth felt the color drain from her face. "That won't be necessary." Caleb remained across the street only a moment longer. Then he turned away toward the livery stable, without speaking to either of them. The ride back to Broken Wheel Ranch passed mostly in silence. That evening, Caleb worked late in the barn checking harness straps that did not need checking. Ruth prepared supper and left his plate warming near the stove, but he never came inside until long after the food had gone cold. Days settled into something strained after that. Conversations became brief, practical. Caleb still thanked her when needed, still listened when she spoke about feed tallies or supply orders. But the easy quiet that had slowly formed between them disappeared like heat escaping through cracked walls. Ruth understood why. A stranger arrives carrying debts tied to another man's failures. Ranches had folded over smaller troubles than that. One morning before sunrise, Ruth hurried into the stable office, searching for her scarf before the north pasture riders left. Snow had already started blowing sideways outside, and the office stove had burned itself low during the night. The scarf was gone. For a moment, panic tightened her throat until she noticed it folded neatly outside her door back at the bunkhouse hall. No note, no knock, just the wool scarf placed carefully atop the railing where snow could not touch it. She held it for a long time before wrapping it around her neck. That night, Ruth sat alone at the office desk, listening to wind scrape across the stable roof. The payroll ledger lay open beneath the lamp. Slowly, carefully, she folded a single page and slid it underneath, a letter of resignation written in her neat, steady hand. She had just lowered the lamp flame when footsteps sounded outside. Caleb entered carrying a lantern and stopped when he saw the paper corner beneath the ledger. His expression changed immediately, not anger. Something quieter than that. Caleb looked at the folded resignation letter beneath the payroll ledger, then slowly set the lantern down beside the stove. Wind groaned through the stable walls outside, carrying loose snow beneath the door in thin white lines. Ruth stood from the desk at once, her face calm in the way people learn to be calm when they expect disappointment before it arrives. "You should have told me," Caleb said at last. Ruth lowered her eyes briefly. "I intended to once the debts were settled enough not to touch the ranch. That wasn't your decision alone." The words came rougher than he intended. Caleb dragged a tired hand across his jaw and stared toward the dark window instead of at her. For a moment, neither spoke. Then the north pasture bell rang hard outside. One of the ranch hands burst through the stable doors, carrying snow over the floorboards. 2 horses from the Forsyth transport had gone lame near the creek crossing, and another had torn its leg fighting the frozen trailer ramp. By midnight, the temperature had dropped so sharply, the water troughs froze solid beside the lower corrals. Everything after that moved fast. Lanterns swung through blowing snow while Caleb and the men hauled injured horses into the larger stable. Ruth carried blankets from the bunkhouse, boiled water in dented iron pots, and copied medicine instructions, while Caleb worked beside the veterinarian from Fallon County, who finally arrived near dawn with frost gathered white along his mustache. Nobody slept much the next 3 nights. The stable office became a second home. Feed orders covered one wall. Wet gloves steamed beside the coal stove. A cracked blue enamel mug sat near the ledgers. For so long, neither Ruth nor Caleb remembered who had poured the last coffee into it. The cold seemed endless. One evening, Ruth stepped outside to help secure tack before another freeze rolled in from the north. Rope burned against her palms while she dragged frozen harness lines into the shed, and by the time she returned inside, her hands had split raw across the skin near her thumbs. She tried hiding it. Caleb noticed anyway. "Sit down," he said quietly. Ruth started to protest, but something in his voice stopped her. Caleb pulled the horse medicine tin from the shelf beside the stove and opened a roll of clean bandages. His hands moved carefully, slower than usual, wrapping the cloth around her palms, while the stable lantern flickered low beside them. "You don't have to keep proving you can carry everything alone," he muttered. Ruth watched him tie the final knot. Neither do you. That made him pause. Outside, the horses shifted restlessly in their stalls, while sleet rattled hard against the roof. Caleb remained crouched beside her chair a second longer than necessary before finally leaning back against the desk. I handled things poorly, he said. Ruth looked at him quietly. When I heard about the debts, I thought maybe you planned on leaving once the trouble caught up. He gave a tired shake of his head. Truth is, I got used to you being here faster than I realized. The honesty in it settled heavily between them. Ruth stared toward the stove where orange light moved softly across the kettle. My husband borrowed money without telling me, she said after a while. For treatments, for train travel. By the end, we mostly stopped talking about hard things because neither of us could fix them. Caleb listened without interruption. I kept thinking silence would make disappointment smaller, she continued. It never did. The room fell quiet again except for the creak of stable boards shifting in the wind. Caleb looked down at the fresh bandages around her hands, his expression unreadable in the dim light. You don't owe me explanations for surviving, he said finally. Something in Ruth's face softened then. Not a relief exactly. More like exhaustion easing its grip for a moment. Near dawn, the worst of the freeze finally broke. The veterinarian believed the injured horses would recover if infection stayed clear. And by afternoon, weak sunlight pushed through the clouds for the first time in days. Snowmelt dripped steadily from the stable roof, while ranch hands moved slower now, worn thin from the long cold. Caleb stood alone beside the office doorway, watching Ruth cross the yard, carrying fresh inventory sheets beneath one arm. Her brown coat moved lightly in the wind, dark green stitching still visible along the cuff she kept repairing instead of replacing. He realized then something had changed without his permission. The ranch no longer felt empty once she left a room. Spring reached Miles City slowly that year. Snow still lingered in the shadows of fence lines, but the fields beyond Broken Wheel Ranch softened into wet earth and pale green shoots. Wagon tracks cut deep through the thawed mud along Powder Creek Road, and branding smoke drifted low across the pasture most mornings before the sun fully climbed the hills. The ranch survived the winter, barely, but it survived. By March, Caleb had renegotiated the horse breeding contract with a buyer out of Helena who nearly walked away after the freeze damaged several animals. Ruth's records helped prove which losses came from weather and which came from the false invoices tied to Hollow Creek Feed Company. Once the bank manager in Miles City saw the corrected ledgers, even he admitted somebody had been draining the ranch long before Ruth arrived. Work settled into steadier rhythms after that. Caleb rode fence lines at dawn, while Ruth handled supply orders beside the office window with the repaired curtain still hanging slightly crooked near the hem. Ranch hands stopped questioning why she carried payroll ledgers beneath her arm during cattle counts. Most simply accepted that if Ruth said feed was low or tack needed replacing, Caleb listened. One evening after branding records were finished, the ranch finally fell quiet. The riders had drifted toward town. Horses stamped softly in the stable. Outside the kitchen window, smoke from the branding fires moved slow across the darkening pasture while frogs sounded faintly near the creek banks swollen with snowmelt. Ruth sat at the kitchen table, reviewing inventory totals one last time before closing the ledger. Across from her, Caleb folded and unfolded the same invoice without seeming aware he was doing it. 3 times he straightened the edge against the table. Ruth noticed. "You've been trying to say something for the last 10 minutes, she said softly. Caleb let out a breath through his nose, almost a laugh, but not quite. Then he set the paper down carefully between them. "I went into town yesterday," he said. Ruth looked up. "I settled the remaining debt notices from St. Louis." Silence filled the kitchen. Ruth's shoulders stiffened immediately. "Caleb, listen first." His voice stayed calm. though his hands remained tight against the table edge. "The receipts are yours, not mine." He slid a small stack of folded papers toward her. Legal releases, debt closures, final notices stamped paid in dark ink. "I didn't do it to keep you here," he said quietly. "And I didn't do it because I think you owe me something afterward." Ruth stared down at the documents without touching them. The stove crackled softly behind them. "For months," Caleb continued, "every plan I make starts including you before I even realize it does." He gave a small shake of his head, like the truth embarrassed him some. "Feed orders, horse sales, who rides into town, what time supper waits. Doesn't seem to matter. Somewhere along the line, this stopped feeling like my ranch alone." Ruth finally lifted her eyes. There was no grand speech waiting there, no practiced charm, just a tired rancher sitting beneath dim kitchen light trying to speak honestly before courage failed him. "I'm not asking you to stay because you need help," he said. "Truth is, I think I'm the one who stopped wanting to do this place alone." The words settled slowly between them. Outside, a horse snorted softly near the stable fence. Ruth looked down at the papers again. All winter she had prepared herself for leaving. Temporary work, temporary room, temporary safety. She had repeated those things so often they became part of her breathing. But the thought of packing her trunk now filled her with something heavier than fear. Caleb reached for the invoice again, straightening its edge for the fourth time before catching himself. Ruth almost smiled at that. "You nervous, Mr. Mercer?" she asked quietly. He looked at her then, finally letting some of the truth show plain on his face. "More than I was during the winter freeze." That pulled a soft laugh from her before either of them expected it. Small, tired, real. Ruth rested her hand gently over his where it lay beside the ledger book. Caleb stilled beneath her touch. "I think," she said carefully, "I'm tired of living temporary lives." Neither moved for a long moment. The kitchen remained warm around them while evening settled over Broken Wheel Ranch, steady and unhurried. No promises rushed forward. No dramatic declarations, just two people sitting side by side after a long winter, finally willing to stop standing at the edge of things. Months later, cattle moved through the rail pens outside Miles City beneath bright summer sun. Riders shouted across the dust while calves crowded tightly against the loading fences. One of the ranch hands waved toward Caleb and Ruth crossing the yard together near the stock gate. "Ask over at the Mercer's ranch," he called. Not Mercer's place anymore, the Mercer's ranch. And somehow, without either of them noticing exactly when it happened, the name fit. Maybe that's how real love works sometimes. Not loud, not fast. Just two tired people, slowly building a place where neither of them feels alone anymore. If this story touched your heart, leave a simple 1 in the comments so I know. You stayed with Ruth and Caleb all the way to the end. And if you still believe love can arrive later in life, even after disappointment and hard winters, make sure you subscribe and come back for the next Western love story waiting just down the trail. Until next time, take care of yourself, and don't stop believing that new beginnings can still find us.